They thought they were cornering a nobody in his own backyard. They saw a large man with a spatula and assumed he was an easy target. Whisper intensity, but as the first blow landed, they realized their fatal mistake. They hadn't just cornered a man, they'd awakened a sleeping Navy SEAL. The Georgia sun was a physical weight, pressing down on Jerome's backyard and turning the air into a thick, humid soup of charcoal smoke and anticipation. Jerome moved with a grace that betrayed his size, his large frame gliding around the grill with the muscle memory of a lifetime ago, skills forged in shadows and salt water that refused to fade. "Now these right here," Jerome said, a grin splitting his face as he pressed a spatula against a rack of glistening ribs. "These are going to make you forget all about your mama's cooking." Vanessa laughed, her eyes bright as she arranged plates of potato salad. "Don't let her hear you say that, Jerome. She'll drive down here just to prove you wrong." The yard was alive with the sounds of a perfect Sunday. 16-year-old Tobias showing off basketball moves, 13-year-old Illa making clover chains in the grass, and neighbors sharing stories over peach cobbler. It was the dream Jerome had carried through every long, dark night overseas. But the peace was fragile. A patrol car rolled slowly past the fence, the officer inside studying the gathering with a cold, clinical gaze. Jerome's hand paused. Automatically, his mind logged the details: car number, time, direction, years of training dying hard. He tried to push the paranoia away. Today was for family. Then the second cruiser arrived. The chirp of the siren cut through the soft soul music like a blade. Silence fell over the yard, broken only by the sizzle of fat on the coals. Sergeant Rick Danner and Officer Mason Holt stepped out, their hands resting purposefully on their duty belts. They weren't there to keep the peace, they were there to exert power. As they strode through the gate, Jerome set down his tongs. He stepped forward, positioning his massive frame between the intruders and his family. "Afternoon, officers," Jerome said, his voice a steady, low rumble. "Is there something I can help you with?" Danner didn't offer a greeting. "We've got noise complaints, multiple calls." It was a transparent lie. The music was barely a whisper, and half the neighbors were already at the party. Vanessa tried to de-escalate, offering a plate of food with a cautious smile. Danner's response was a violent flick of his wrist, sending the ribs scattering into the dirt. "We're not here for your food, ma'am." The air in the yard turned electric. Jerome reached for his ID with slow, telegraphed movements, trying to keep the situation from igniting. But Danner was looking for a fire. He scanned the well-kept yard, the new grill, the beautiful home. "How exactly did you manage to afford a place like this, boy?" The word was a slur, a poison that hung in the humid air. Jerome's jaw tightened until it felt like it might crack, but he answered evenly, "I own an auto repair shop on Madison Street. Been there 15 years. Danner took the ID, mocking Jerome's name before invading his personal space, trying to loom over the big man. "Are you telling me how to do my job?" Danner sneered. Then came the push. Danner's hands slammed into Jerome's chest without warning. Jerome stumbled back, his shoes scuffing the dirt, but his eyes never left Danner. Behind him, his son Tobias lurched forward in a rage, but Jerome's arm shot out, a silent command for the boy to stay back. "Son, stay where you are," Jerome commanded, his voice eerily controlled despite the thunder of his pulse. Danner was smirking now, his hand resting on his holster, waiting, hopping, for the big man to swing. He thought he was in control. He thought the uniform made him the apex predator in this yard. But Jerome High Tower wasn't just a mechanic or a fat boy at a barbecue. He was a man who had survived combat zones where the rules didn't exist. Every muscle in his body was screaming to neutralize the threat, to protect the terrified faces of his wife and children watching from the sidelines. Vanessa stepped forward again, her voice trembling but brave. "This is out of line, Sergeant. We know our rights." Dana turned on her like a viper. "Maybe you should teach your husband some manners instead of running that mouth." The backhand was a brutal, sharp crack. Time froze as Vanessa stumbled sideways, a red mark blooming on her cheek. The world narrowed to a point of crystal clarity for Jerome. The barbecue, the neighbors, the sunlight, it all faded into the background. Training took over. He didn't charge, he glided. Before Officer Holt could even clear his holster, Jerome's hands found the pressure points on the young man's wrist with surgical precision. One twist, and the gun clattered into the grass as Holt collapsed to his knees in shock. Dana lunged with his baton swinging, a desperate arc of wood, but Jerome was already there. He redirected Dana's momentum with the fluid ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times in the dark. In one smooth motion, Jerome trapped the sergeant's arm in a joint lock, forcing the larger man up onto his toes. "That's enough," Jerome whispered, his voice a cold, terrifying calm that silenced the entire yard. "Don't make me break it." The neighborhood sat in stunned silence. The nobody they had tried to humiliate was now holding the power of life and death in his hands, and every second was being recorded by the phones of the people they had tried to silence. The silence in the backyard was heavier than the Georgia heat. Sergeant Dana was staring into the eyes of a man he thought he could break, whisper, but all he found was the cold, hard steel of a warrior who had nothing left to lose. The neighborhood held its breath. The air, once filled with the sweet scent of hickory smoke and the sound of children's laughter, was now thick with the metallic tang of adrenaline. Jerome High Tower stood like an oak tree in the center of his own lawn, his massive hand locked around Sergeant Dana's wrist. The sergeant's face, previously flushed with the red of arrogant anger, was now turning a sickly shade of white. "Let go of me," Dana hissed, though his voice lacked its earlier bite. He tried to pull away, but it was like trying to move a mountain. Jerome didn't budge. He didn't shout. He didn't even breathe heavily. "You laid hands on my wife," Jerome whispered. The words weren't a complaint, they were a verdict. Officer Holt, still clutching his throbbing wrist on the ground, looked up in terror. He saw the way Jerome stood, feet planted, weight distributed, eyes scanning not just the two of them, but the perimeter of the yard. This wasn't the stance of a fat boy at a barbecue. This was the stance of a man who had cleared rooms in Fallujah. "Dana, stop," Holt croaked, but it was too late. Dana's ego was a runaway train. With his free hand, he reached for the taser on his belt. It was a desperate, clumsy move. To a civilian, it might have been fast. To Jerome, it was happening in slow motion. Jerome transitioned. In one fluid movement, he released Dana's wrist and stepped inside the man's guard. He used the palm of his hand to redirect the sergeant's arm, sending the taser flying into the grass. Before Dana could even blink, Jerome's forearm was pressed against the sergeant's throat, pinning him against the very grill where the ribs were still sizzling. "Dad, no," Tobias yelled from the porch, his voice cracking. That voice, his son's voice, was the only thing that kept Jerome from finishing the move. The red mist that soldiers talk about, that blurring of the world into targets and threats, began to recede. Jerome looked at his son, then at Vanessa, who was holding her bruised cheek, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and pride. Jerome exhaled, a long, slow hiss of air. He stepped back, raising his hands, palms open. "Get off my property," Jerome said, his voice returning to that low, gravelly rumble. "Now." Dana coughed, gasping for air, his hands clutching his throat. He looked around and realized the nightmare had just begun for him. Every neighbor on the block had their phone out. The blue-collar families, the elderly couples, the teenagers, Everyone was recording. "You're under arrest," Dana wheezed, stumbling toward his fallen baton. "Assaulting an officer, interference. You're going to rot in a cage, High Tower." "I haven't moved from my property, Sergeant," Jerome replied calmly. "You entered without a warrant. You assaulted a civilian. You struck a woman. And it's all on camera." Dana didn't care about logic. He was a man who lived by the badge, and he had just been humiliated in front of the people he liked to bully. He grabbed his radio. "Officer needs assistance. 1033, I have a violent suspect at 442 Maple Drive. Send everyone. Suspect is armed and dangerous." "Armed?" Officer Holt looked at Jerome, who was standing there with nothing but a pair of barbecue tongs in his hand. "Sergeant, he's not armed." "Shut up, Holt, he's a threat," Dana screamed. The sound of distant sirens began to wail, growing louder with every passing second. One car, then three, then six. The calm Sunday afternoon was being invaded by a small army. Vanessa ran to Jerome's side, grabbing his arm. "Jerome, they're going to kill you. Please just run." Jerome looked down at her and placed a hand over hers. "I spent 10 years running toward the gunfire so I wouldn't have to run in my own backyard, Nessa. I'm not going anywhere." He turned to the crowd of neighbors. "Everyone, inside, now take the kids." The neighbors scrambled, sensing the shift in the wind. Tobias grabbed Illa, shielding her eyes as they ran into the house. Only Jerome and Vanessa remained on the lawn, standing in the shadow of their home as the first wave of police cruisers drifted onto the curb, tires screeching, dust clouds rising. Doors flew open, shotguns were racked. The click-clack of weapons being readied echoed through the street like a death knell. "Get on the ground, face down, hands behind your head," a voice boomed over a megaphone. Dana retreated toward the line of cars, a wicked smile returning to his face. He whispered to himself, "Let's see how tough you are against 30 Glocks, fat boy." Jerome didn't get on the ground. He stood tall, his chest out, his head held high. He knew the protocol. He knew they were looking for any reason to pull the trigger. He also knew something they didn't. He knew that the man currently sitting in the lead cruiser, the precinct commander, was someone Jerome had pulled out of a burning Humvee in 2009. As Commander Miller stepped out of the car, his eyes went from the chaotic scene to the large man standing defiantly in the yard. Miller stopped dead in his tracks. He lowered his weapon. "Hold your fire," Miller roared, his voice carrying over the sirens. "Nobody pulls a trigger, stand down." Dana ran up to the commander, frantic. "Sir, he assaulted us. He's a maniac. Look at Holt's wrist. We need to take him down now." Commander Miller didn't even look at Dana. He kept his eyes on Jerome. The two men locked gazes, a silent conversation between two people who had seen the worst of humanity. "Jerome," Miller asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Commander," Jerome nodded slowly, "your boy Dana here thinks my backyard is a war zone. I was just showing him what a real soldier looks like." The tension was a physical cord stretched to the breaking point. 30 officers had their sights trained on Jerome's heart, waiting for a single twitch. Dana was shaking with rage, his hand hovering over his holster, his mind screaming for blood. He didn't know that the fat boy he had targeted was a decorated hero. He didn't know that the recording on those neighbors' phones was already hitting the internet. And he certainly didn't know that in 5 minutes, his career and his freedom would be over. Jerome took one step forward. A dozen lasers danced across his chest. "I'm not the one who broke the law today, Commander," Jerome said, his voice echoing off the houses. "But I am the one who's going to finish this." Commander Miller looked at the man he owed his life to, then at the snake wearing his department's badge. The neighborhood held its breath as the power shifted. Because when a lion stops roaring and starts calculating, the hunters are the ones who should be afraid. The red dots of 30 laser sights danced across Jerome High Tower's chest like lethal fireflies. Any other man would have collapsed, trembling, begging for mercy. But Jerome stood like a monument of black granite. His eyes weren't on the guns, they were locked on Commander Miller's face. "Stand down," I said, "stand down." Miller's voice cracked like a whip across the asphalt. Slowly, reluctantly, the younger officers lowered their weapons, their eyes darting between their commander and the massive man in the stained barbecue apron. Dana was vibrating with a frantic, desperate energy. "Commander, you don't understand. He's a domestic threat. He put hands on Officer Holt. He's resisting." "He's a Navy SEAL, Dana," Miller roared, turning on his sergeant with a fury that made the onlookers flinch. "He's a Bronze Star recipient. He's a man who has spilled more blood for this country than you've ever seen in a movie. Now back up." The word SEAL rippled through the line of officers. The tension didn't vanish, but it transformed. It turned from aggression into a cold, sinking realization. They hadn't surrounded a criminal, they had besieged a hero. Jerome finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but in the sudden silence of the street, it carried to every ear. "Commander, I respect you. I respect the uniform you're wearing, but your man here, he didn't come for a noise complaint. He came for a fight. He struck my wife, Miller. He threw our food in the dirt. He called me boy in front of my children." Miller's face hardened into a mask of stone. He turned to Dana, whose bravado was beginning to leak out of him like air from a punctured tire. "Is this true, Sergeant?" "He's lying," Dana shouted, his voice hitting a high, panicked note. "I followed protocol. He was aggressive. I had to secure the scene." Jerome didn't argue. He simply pointed a thick finger toward the houses across the street. "Check the cameras, Miller. Check my neighbor's phones. Check Officer Holt's body cam, if Dana hasn't made him turn it off yet." Miller looked at Officer Holt. The rookie was pale, his hand still clutched against his chest where Jerome had neutralized him. "Holt," Miller said, his voice dangerously low, "hand over your camera, now." Holt didn't hesitate. He unclipped the device with shaking fingers and handed it to the commander. Dana reached out, a reflexive, guilty movement to intercept it, but Miller pushed him back with a shoulder. The neighborhood watched in a haunting silence as Miller hit the playback button. The small screen flickered. The audio was unmistakable. The sneering insults, the sound of the plate hitting the ground, and then the sharp, sickening crack of Dana's hand hitting Vanessa's face. Miller's hand began to shake, not with fear, but with a righteous, burning rage. He looked up from the screen, his eyes burning into Dana. "You're done," Miller whispered. "Sir, wait. Hand me your badge, Rick, and your sidearm. You are under administrative arrest, pending a dozen felony charges." Dana's eyes went wide. He looked at the line of officers, his brothers in arms. He expected support, but he found only averted gazes and disgusted scowls. He looked at Jerome, hoping to see a smug smile he could use to fuel his anger. But Jerome's face was empty. There was no joy in this victory. There was only the cold satisfaction of justice. "I'm not giving you anything," Dana hissed. His hand moved. It was a twitch, a momentary lapse in judgment fueled by a lifetime of unchecked ego. He went for his backup weapon hidden at his ankle. He never even got his fingers around the grip. Jerome moved like a blur of shadow. Before the other officers could even register Dana's movement, Jerome had closed the distance. He didn't use a gun, he used his weight. He hit Dana with a shoulder check that sounded like two cars colliding. Dana flew backward, his breath leaving his lungs in a sharp whoosh, landing hard against the side of his own cruiser. Jerome stood over him, looking down at the man who had tried to ruin his Sunday. You're slow, Sergeant. In the real world, that gets you killed. In this world, it just gets you humiliated. Miller stepped forward, his boots heavy on the pavement. He didn't stop Jerome. He waited until Dana was gasping on the ground before leaning over and unpinning the badge from the man's chest. "Get him out of here," Miller ordered. Two officers stepped forward, roughly pulling Dana to his feet and shoving him into the back of a transport van. The tough guy who had marched into the yard an hour ago was now sobbing, his face pressed against the wire mesh of the cage. The sirens were turned off. The red and blue lights stopped their frantic dancing, leaving the yard in the soft, golden glow of the setting Georgia sun. Miller turned to Jerome and Vanessa. He took off his cap and held it against his chest. "Jerome, Vanessa, I don't have the words. This department, we failed you today. I failed you." Vanessa, her face still swollen, stepped forward. She didn't look at the commander. She looked at the police cars lining her street. "You didn't just fail us, Commander. You showed us that even in our own backyard, we aren't safe from the people sworn to protect us. A badge isn't a shield for your ego." Jerome put an arm around his wife, drawing her close. "The video is already online, Miller. It's got 10,000 views. By tonight, it'll be 1,000,000. You can't bury this." "I don't want to bury it," Miller said firmly. "I want to fix it. But I think you know, Jerome, Dana has friends high up. This isn't over just because he's in handcuffs." Jerome looked at his house, where his children were watching through the window, their faces pressed against the glass. He felt the weight of his past and the uncertainty of his future. "Let them come," Jerome said, his voice echoing with the authority of a man who had survived the worst the world could throw at him. "I've spent my life fighting for other people's freedom. I think it's time I fought for my own." The crowd of neighbors began to cheer, a low rumble that grew into a roar of defiance. But Jerome didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a father who had just been forced back into a war he thought he'd left behind. As the police cars began to pull away, one remained. Officer Holt sat in the driver's seat, his head in his hands. He looked up as Jerome approached the window. "I'm sorry," Holt whispered. Jerome looked at the young man. "Being sorry is easy, son. Being brave is hard. Next time, don't wait for a commander to tell you what's right." Jerome turned back to his yard. The grill was cold. The food was ruined. But as his children ran out to hug him, Jerome High Tower knew one thing for certain. The battle for the backyard was won, but the war for the city was just beginning. They didn't just lock him in a cell, they tried to erase his truth. While the world watched a doctored lie on the news, Jerome High Tower sat in the darkness, waiting for the one piece of evidence that would turn their perfect frame job into a suicide mission. The steel door of the holding cell slammed shut with a finality that would have broken a lesser man. For Jerome, it was just another perimeter. He sat on the cold concrete bench, his back straight, his mind running through tactical drills. He knew how this worked. In the desert, it was insurgents. Here, it was men with badges and technical issues with their body cams. "Mr. High Tower," a voice dripped with manufactured sympathy. Captain Brenda Ames stood at the bars, her uniform as sharp and cold as a razor blade. "I've seen your record. Bronze Star, Navy SEAL. It would be a tragedy to see all that replaced by a felony conviction." Jerome didn't look up. "Then tell your sergeant to stop lying, Captain." Ames leaned in, her voice dropping to a low, icy threat. "We reviewed the footage. It's inconclusive. But if you plead guilty to assaulting an officer, we can make this go away. Probation, anger management, no jail time." She paused, letting the silence hang. "Think about your family, Jerome. Think about your wife's teaching career. This could follow them forever." Jerome finally looked up. His eyes weren't filled with fear. They were filled with the same steady fire that had seen him through 100 night raids. "No deal," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the bars. "Get out of my cell." While Jerome sat in silence, the world outside was screaming. On every local news channel, the narrative was being twisted by a professional machine. They didn't show the barbecue or the children. They showed a menacing, carefully selected mugshot. The headlines read, "Violent veteran attacks officers and military training turned against law enforcement." Even the neighbors who had stood in the yard were beginning to doubt their own eyes as the official department statement flooded social media. But the shadow friends of Sergeant Danner weren't satisfied with just a character assassination. They wanted to crush the spirit of the High Tower family. At 9:47 p.m., the peace of the High Tower home was shattered, not by a siren, but by the sound of a brick exploding through the front window. Illa's scream pierced the night as glass rained down onto the carpet. Tobias scrambled for a kitchen knife, his young face contorted with a mixture of terror and rage. Vanessa, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, found the brick. Wrapped around it with a thick rubber band was a typed note: "Drop the case or lose everything." Vanessa stood in the middle of her broken living room, the cool night air rushing through the jagged hole in her window. She looked at her terrified children. She felt the weight of the dark sedan that had been following her all day, a ghost in her rearview mirror that refused to vanish. "Mom," Tobias whispered, his voice cracking. "What do we do?" Vanessa tightened her grip on the note until her knuckles turned white. She remembered what Jerome told her before the cruiser pulled away. "Stay strong. I'll handle this." "We don't get angry, Tobias," she said, her voice trembling but gaining strength with every word. "We get smart." She didn't call the police. She knew the police were the ones who sent the brick. Instead, she called David Reese, a civil rights attorney who knew how to fight monsters in suits. "They're getting desperate, Vanessa," Reese told her over the phone as a private security team he'd hired pulled into her driveway. "That's good for us. It means they know they have a leak." And the leak was real. 2 days later, in a dark, oil-stained parking lot behind an abandoned Walmart, the tide began to turn. A nervous data technician named Eli Vargas met Reese in the shadows. He was trembling, his eyes darting to every passing shadow. "If they find out I gave you this, I'm a dead man," Vargas whispered, pressing a small USB drive into Reese's hand. Back at the office, as the file loaded, Vanessa and Reese held their breath. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't the inconclusive footage Ames had lied about. It was the dashcam video from Danner's own cruiser, crystal clear, high definition, and devastating. The audio picked up Danner's voice before he even stepped out of the car. "Watch this. I'm gonna take this big boy down a peg." The video showed the unprovoked push. It showed the brutal backhand to Vanessa's face. And then it showed Jerome's response, not as an aggressive attack, but as a masterclass in defensive restraint. "It's all here," Vanessa whispered, tears of relief finally spilling over. "The whole lie." Reese leaned back, a grim smile touching his lips. "They think they've buried Jerome. They don't realize they just gave us the shovel we're going to use to bury them." But as they watched the screen, a new shadow appeared in the footage. A third vehicle had been parked down the street, a vehicle that didn't belong to the precinct. The conspiracy was deeper than a few bad cops. Jerome High Tower hadn't just angered a sergeant, he had stepped on the toes of a power structure that ran the entire city, and they were already planning their next move. The courtroom was a lion's den, and they thought Jerome High Tower was the sacrificial lamb. The prosecution had the lies, the media had the headlines. Whisper intensity, but Jerome had a secret that was about to turn the temple of justice into a graveyard for their careers. The air in the Fulton County courthouse was stagnant, smelling of old paper and the sweat of nervous men. Jerome sat at the defense table, his massive shoulders stretching the fabric of a suit that felt like a cage compared to his old tactical gear. Beside him, David Reese was flipping through files, his face a mask of grim determination. Across the aisle sat District Attorney Stephen Vane. Vane was a man built on ambition, his hair perfectly silvered, his smile rehearsed for the cameras. To him, Jerome wasn't a man, he was a stepping stone to the governor's mansion. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. Judge Holloway took the bench. She was known as the Iron Lady, a woman who had no patience for theatrics. She looked at Jerome with a gaze that felt like a laser, searching for a crack in his composure. She found none. D.A. Vane stood up for the opening statement. He walked toward the jury with the confidence of a predator. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vane began, his voice smooth as silk, "this is a simple case. It's a case of a man who thought his military past put him above the law. We will show you evidence of a violent outburst. We will show you a decorated sergeant, Rick Danner, who was simply doing his job when he was brutally neutralized by a killing machine who refused to follow a lawful order." Vane played the official footage, the one the department had edited. It showed Jerome's forearm against Danner's throat. It showed Officer Holt on the ground. It was framed to look like an unprovoked assault. The jury shifted, their faces hardening. Then came the witnesses. Sergeant Danner took the stand, his neck still wrapped in a medical brace for dramatic effect. He lied with the precision of a poet. "I feared for my life," Danner whimpered, dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief. He had this look in his eyes, like he was back in a war zone. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood from his noise." David Reese stood up for the cross-examination. He didn't yell, he didn't pace. He stayed behind the table. "Sergeant Danner," Reese said softly, "you mentioned a noise complaint. Who called it in?" "Anonymous," Danner snapped. "Interesting, because we've subpoenaed the dispatch logs. There was no call, not one. In fact, the neighbors were at the barbecue, so why were you really there?" "Objection," Vane shouted. "Irrelevant." "Sustained," the judge ruled. Danner smirked. He thought he was safe. He thought the shadow friends had scrubbed the world clean. But then Reese turned toward the gallery. The defense calls Eli Vargas to the stand. A collective gasp rippled through the room. D.A. Vane's face turned the color of ash. Eli Vargas, the nervous technician, walked down the aisle. He looked like he wanted to vanish, but he kept his eyes on Jerome. Jerome gave him a single, slow nod, the soldier's acknowledgement. "Mr. Vargas," Reese said, "you work in the digital forensics department of the precinct, correct? Tell the court what happened to the original, unedited footage from the afternoon of July 14th. Vargas swallowed hard. "I was told to delete it by Captain Ames. She said it was corrupted and that we should only use the clips she provided." The courtroom erupted. Judge Holloway slammed her gavel, the sound like a gunshot. "Order, I will have order." "But you didn't delete it, did you, Eli?" Reese pushed. "No," Vargas whispered. "I made a ghost copy because what I saw, it wasn't a crime by the defendant, it was a hit." Reese walked to the evidence locker and pulled out the USB drive. "Your Honor, the defense moves to admit Exhibit G, the ghost files." Vane jumped up, his voice cracking. "Your Honor, this is unverified. This is a fabrication." "Sit down, Mr. Vane," Holloway said, her voice like ice. "Let's see what's on the drive." The lights dimmed. The giant monitor in the courtroom flickered to life. The jury didn't see a killing machine. They saw a father. They saw the steam rising from the grill. They heard Danner's voice through the dashcam. "I'm gonna break this big boy." They saw the backhand hit Vanessa's face. The sound of the slap echoed through the speakers, sharp and sickening. Vanessa, sitting in the front row, closed her eyes, her hand going to her cheek as she relived the pain. On the screen, Jerome moved, but now, with the full context, it didn't look like an assault. It looked like a shield. He didn't strike Dana, he contained him. He protected his family with the surgical precision of a man who valued life more than violence. When the video ended, the silence was deafening. You could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. Dana, still on the stand, began to tremble. His medical brace seemed to be choking him. "Sergeant," Reese said, leaning forward, "the video shows you striking a woman. It shows you lying about a complaint. It shows you reaching for a weapon after the commander arrived. My question is, who told you to go to that house? Because a man like you doesn't pick a fight with a Navy SEAL without someone promising to back him up." Dana looked at D.A. Vane. Vane looked at the ceiling. The silence stretched until it felt like it would snap. Suddenly, the back doors of the courtroom swung open. Two men in dark, tailored suits entered. They didn't look like cops. They looked like the third player, the power behind the curtain. They sat in the back row, their eyes fixed on Dana. Dana saw them. His eyes went wide with a new kind of terror. He realized he was caught between Jerome's truth and his master's wrath. "I can't answer that," Dana choked out. Judge Holloway leaned over her bench. "You will answer, Sergeant, or I will hold you in contempt until the sun burns out." Dana looked at the men in the back. Then he looked at Jerome. "It was the Council of 12, Dana whispered, his voice barely audible. "They wanted the land, the repair shop, the whole block. Jerome wouldn't sell, so they told me to make him a felon, to make him lose his rights so they could seize the property." The revelation was a bomb. It wasn't just a bad cop. It was a corporate conspiracy, a land grab fueled by blood and badges. D.A. Vane gathered his papers, his hands shaking. He knew his career was over, but Jerome knew this was only the first domino. "Your Honor," Reese said, his voice ringing with triumph, "the defense moves for an immediate dismissal of all charges with prejudice." Judge Holloway didn't even hesitate. "Motion granted. Mr. High Tower, you are free to go." The gallery erupted in cheers. Tobias and Illa jumped over the railing to hug their father. Vanessa threw her arms around Jerome, her tears soaking his suit jacket. But as Jerome held his family, he looked toward the back of the room. The two men in suits were gone. They had vanished like shadows when the light is turned on. Jerome knew the war wasn't over. He had won the battle for his freedom, but he had just unmasked the monsters that ran the city. And monsters don't like being seen. As they walked out of the courthouse, a swarm of reporters surrounded them. "Jerome, how do you feel? What's next?" Jerome stopped at the top of the stone steps. He looked out over the city of Georgia, the sun setting behind the skyscrapers. "What's next?" Jerome repeated, his voice deep and certain. "Next, I'm going to finish my barbecue, and then I'm coming for the rest of them." The Council of 12 thought they were the chess players and Jerome was just a pawn to be swept off the board. They didn't realize that in the shadows of the Georgia pines, a brotherhood was reforming. Whisper, and this time, they weren't fighting for a flag, they were fighting for one of their own. Jerome's house was no longer just a home, it was a fortress. The broken window had been replaced with reinforced ballistic glass, and the perimeter was now monitored by high-definition thermal cameras. But the real security wasn't in the tech, it was in the men who started arriving in the dead of night. They came in dusty pickup trucks and nondescript sedans, men with scarred knuckles and eyes that had seen the end of the world. Marcus, a former SEAL sniper who could hit a target from a mile away in a sandstorm. Jackson, a demolitions expert who could take down a skyscraper with a stick of gum and a battery. And Sarah, an intelligence specialist who could disappear into the internet and come back with a cabinet's worth of secrets. They gathered in Jerome's basement under the glow of a single hanging bulb. On the table was a map of the city marked with red circles. "The Council of 12, Sarah said, tapping a screen. "They aren't just businessmen, Jerome. They're a syndicate. Real estate developers, judges, and high-ranking police officials. They've been using eminent domain and police harassment to seize land for a multi-billion-dollar tech corridor. Your shop sits right in the middle of the Phase 1 zone." Marcus leaned against the wall, cleaning a piece of equipment. "They tried to turn you into a felon so they could seize the property through civil forfeiture. When that failed in court, they went to Plan B." "Plan B?" Vanessa asked, standing at the top of the stairs, her voice trembling but her gaze steady. "Plan B is total erasure," Jerome said, his voice like grinding stones. "They don't just want the land anymore, they want the witness gone." Jerome looked at his team, his ghosts. "We've fought in places the map forgot. We've faced warlords and extremists. These men in suits think they're powerful because they have money. They don't know what it's like when the shadows start biting back." The plan was simple but lethal. While the Council of 12 was preparing for a gala at the Diamond Heights Hotel to celebrate their new development project, Jerome's team was preparing a different kind of celebration. Sarah had already breached their private servers. She found the Black Ledger, a digital trail of bribes, threats, and signatures that linked the council to every accidental fire and random arrest in the city for the last decade. But the ledger was encrypted with a revolving key that could only be accessed from a physical terminal inside the council's private office at the hotel. "We need 10 minutes in that room," Jerome said, "during the gala, when they're all in one place, feeling untouchable." "It's a suicide mission, Jerome," Jackson noted, though he was smiling. "The security is private military, ex-special forces." "Good," Jerome replied, "then it'll be a fair fight." The night of the gala arrived. The Diamond Heights Hotel was a tower of glass and gold, crawling with security. Inside, the city's elite sipped champagne, congratulating themselves on their vision for progress. In the center of the room stood the chairman of the council, a man named Arthur Sterling. He was the one who had sent the men in suits to the courtroom. He was the one who had signed the order to break Jerome's family. Sterling stood at the podium, his voice booming through the speakers. "Today, we don't just build buildings, we build a legacy, and no one, no matter how loud they yell, will stand in the way of our city's future." Suddenly, the lights flickered, just for a second. High above the ballroom, on the 42nd floor, a glass-cutting laser was moving with silent precision. Marcus and Jerome swung through the opening, landing on the plush carpet of the executive suite like shadows. "I'm in," Jerome whispered into his comms. He moved through the dark office, his movements a ghost of the man who had once cleared compounds in the mountains of Afghanistan. He reached the main terminal. He inserted the bypass drive Sarah had built. 2%, 15%, 40%. The progress bar was a slow-motion torture. Outside the door, Jerome heard the heavy rhythm of tactical boots. "Team Alpha, check the executive wing," a voice crackled from a radio in the hallway. "We have a localized power surge." "They're coming, Jerome," Marcus's voice came through the earpiece. "You've got company in 30 seconds. Jerome didn't panic. He checked his watch. He checked the screen. 75%, 88%. The door handle turned. The lock clicked. Jerome stepped behind the heavy mahogany desk. As the door swung open and 3 security guards in full tactical gear burst in, Jerome didn't reach for a gun. He reached for the light switch. The room plunged into total darkness. The guards activated their night vision, But Sarah was ready. She sent a high-frequency strobe pulse through the office's smart lighting system. The night vision goggles flared white, blinding the guards instantly. In the chaos, Jerome was a whirlwind. He didn't use lethal force, he used efficiency. A palm strike to a throat, a sweep of a leg, a redirected elbow. In 10 seconds, 3 highly trained mercenaries were on the floor, gasping for air. 100%. Download complete. I've got it, Jerome said, pulling the drive. But as he turned to leave, the monitors in the room suddenly changed. They didn't show the ledger anymore. They showed a live feed of Jerome's house. He saw Vanessa, he saw Tobias and Illa, and he saw a black van pulling up to the curb, the back doors opening to reveal men with masks and suppressed rifles. A voice came over the office intercom. It was Arthur Sterling, speaking from the ballroom below. Did you really think it would be that easy, Commander High Tower? You're a tactical genius, but you're a sentimental fool. You came for my secrets, but I went for your heart. Jerome felt a coldness in his chest that no winter could match. He looked at the screen, seeing the men move toward his front door. Marcus, Jackson, abandon the extraction, Jerome roared into the comms. They're at the house. Go now. Jerome turned toward the window. He didn't have time for the elevator. He didn't have time for the stairs. He looked at the 40-story drop and the shimmering pool far below. Jerome, what are you doing? Sarah's voice screamed in his ear. I'm taking the short way, Jerome said. He smashed the glass with a heavy chair, took a 3-step lead, and threw himself into the night air. As he fell through the Georgia night, the wind screaming past his ears, Jerome High Tower had only one thought. If they touch a hair on their heads, there won't be enough of the council left to bury. Jerome was falling through the sky, but his mind was already in his living room. The council thought they had found his weakness by targeting his family. Whisper with lethal intent, they didn't realize they had just stripped away the only thing keeping the monster inside Jerome High Tower on a leash. Gravity is a cruel mistress, but for a man who has jumped into hostile territory more times than he can count, it was just a transport vehicle. Jerome's parachute, a small, tactical black canopy Sarah had hidden in the suite's emergency kit, snapped open just hundreds of feet above the hotel's massive pool. The jerk nearly dislocated his shoulders, but Jerome didn't feel the pain. He hit the water like a depth charge, surfaced, and was sprinting toward a parked motorcycle before the hotel security even reached the pool deck. Sarah, status, Jerome roared into his comms as he kicked the engine to life. The van is in your driveway, Jerome. 3 men are out, suppressed MP5s. They're breaching the back door. Sarah's voice was frantic, the sound of keyboard clicking echoing behind her. Jackson and Marcus are 4 minutes out. They won't make it in time. I'll be there in 2, Jerome growled. He twisted the throttle, and the bike screamed through the Georgia night, weaving through traffic like a jagged bolt of lightning. Back at the house, the world had turned into a nightmare. Vanessa had heard the tires screech. She didn't wait. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove and shoved Tobias and Illa into the safe room Jerome had insisted on building behind the pantry. Stay quiet. Do not open this door unless you hear your father's voice, she whispered, her face pale but her eyes burning. Garage. The back door splintered. 3 shadows moved into the kitchen, their laser sights cutting through the dark like red needles. They moved with professional discipline, no talking, just the sound of heavy boots on hardwood. Check the bedrooms, the leader whispered. Vanessa was pressed against the wall in the shadows of the hallway. As the first man passed her, she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She swung the iron skillet with every ounce of terror and love in her body. It connected with the side of the man's tactical helmet with a sickening clang. He crumpled, but the sound alerted the others. "Target engaged," the second man yelled, swinging his weapon toward the hallway. Suddenly, the front of the house exploded. Jerome didn't use the door. He drove the motorcycle through the large front window, the bike skidding across the hardwood, glass spraying like diamonds. He didn't even wait for the bike to stop sliding. He rolled off, drew his sidearm, and fired 2 rounds in midair. The second gunman's laser sight vanished as he fell. Jerome hit the floor, kicked the sofa over for cover, and scanned the room. The third man, the leader, dove behind the kitchen island. "High Tower," the leader shouted. "Give us the drive and maybe the kids live." Jerome's voice came from the darkness, sounding less like a human and more like a force of nature. "You made a mistake coming to my house. You made a mistake touching my door, and now you're out of time." Jerome pulled a flashbang from his tactical vest, one he'd grabbed from the guards at the hotel. He cooked it for 2 seconds and rolled it across the floor. Bang! The kitchen erupted in a white-hot light. The leader screamed, clutching his eyes. Jerome didn't fire his gun. He wanted this to be personal. He moved through the white smoke like a ghost. He grabbed the leader by the throat, hoisting the armored man off the ground with one hand. "Who sent you?" Jerome asked, his voice a terrifying whisper. "Sterling, the council. They said you'd fold," the man wheezed. Jerome leaned in close. "Tell Sterling I'm done playing defense." He dropped the man just as Marcus and Jackson burst through what was left of the back door, their weapons drawn. They saw the carnage, the shattered window, the bike in the living room, and Jerome standing in the center of it all, his knuckles bleeding and his eyes cold. "Family?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Jerome walked to the pantry. "Nessa, it's me." The hidden door slid open. Vanessa collapsed into his arms, shaking, as Tobias and Illa clung to his waist. For a moment, the warrior disappeared, and the father returned. He kissed the top of Vanessa's head, smelling the barbecue smoke that still lingered in her hair from the afternoon. "Are you okay?" he whispered. "We are now," she sobbed. But the moment was short-lived. Jackson stepped over one of the downed gunmen and looked at Jerome. "The police are 5 minutes out, not Miller's guys. These are the council's cleaners. If we're here when they arrive, we're going to jail for massacre." Jerome looked at his ruined home. He looked at the USB drive in his pocket. He had the evidence. He had the names. He had the bribes. But he knew that in this city, the law followed the money. "We're not going to jail," Jerome said, turning to his team. "And we're not running. Sarah, get that drive ready. Broadcast the contents. Every news station, every social media platform, every police server in the country. Don't wait for a fair trial." "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked over the comms. Jerome looked at the leader of the hit squad, who was groaning on the floor. He picked up the man's radio. "I'm going to the gala," Jerome said. "Arthur Sterling is still waiting for a phone call. I think I'll deliver the news in person." Marcus smiled, a predatory glint in his eyes. "The whole team." "The whole team," Jerome confirmed. "Load up. We're going to burn the council down." As they stepped out onto the lawn, the neighborhood was waking up. Lights were flickering on. Neighbors were stepping onto their porches, seeing the hero of their block standing amidst the wreckage of his life. Jerome looked at his house, the place he had fought so hard to keep. It was broken, but the foundation was still strong, just like him. "Jackson, prep the special package," Jerome ordered. "If we're going to crash a party, we might as well bring fireworks." The sirens were getting louder. The blue and red lights were reflecting off the smoke rising from the house. But Jerome High Tower wasn't looking back. He was looking toward the Diamond Heights Hotel. The Council of 12 thought they could take his land. They thought they could take his life, but they had forgotten the most important rule of engagement. Never corner a man who has nothing to lose but his family. The lights of the Diamond Heights Hotel were blinding, a golden crown for a city built on secrets. Arthur Sterling thought he was presiding over coronation. Whisper, he didn't realize he was actually attending his own funeral. The warrior had arrived, and the reckoning was non-negotiable. The grand ballroom was a sea of tuxedos and silk gowns. Arthur Sterling stood at the center of the stage, a glass of $1,000 champagne in his hand. He looked like a king. He had sent his wolves to Maple Drive, and he was waiting for the call to tell him the High Tower problem had been permanently erased. Suddenly, the massive double doors of the ballroom didn't just open, they were blown off their hinges. The explosion was controlled, a deafening boom that sent a cloud of white smoke rolling into the hall. The music died instantly. Screams erupted as the city's elite scrambled away from the entrance. Through the smoke, a silhouette emerged. Jerome High Tower didn't wear a suit. He wore his tactical vest, his boots caked with the mud of his own backyard, his face a mask of cold, hard justice. Behind him stood Marcus and Jackson, their weapons at the low ready, their eyes scanning the room like predators. Sterling, Jerome's voice didn't need a microphone. It vibrated through the floorboards, silencing the entire room. Arthur Sterling stepped back, his face turning the color of ash. Security, get him out of here, shoot him. The private security teams moved, but they were too late. The giant screens behind the stage, the ones meant to show the council's vision for the future, suddenly flickered. Sarah had flipped the switch. Instead of architectural renderings, the screens began to scroll through the black ledger. Bank transfers to D.A. Vane, recorded phone calls of Captain Ames ordering the destruction of evidence, and then the footage from 442 Maple Drive, the moment Dana struck Vanessa. The ballroom went silent as the city's elite watched their own crimes play out in high definition. The reporters in the room, originally there to praise the council, were now frantically pointing their cameras at the screens. "It's over, Arthur," Jerome said, walking down the center aisle. Every step he took was heavy, purposeful. "The world is watching. There is no shadow big enough for you to hide in anymore." Sterling, cornered and desperate, pulled a small derringer from his vest pocket. It was a coward's weapon. He pointed it at Jerome with shaking hands. "I built this city. You're nothing but a ghost from a dead war." Click! Sterling's gun jammed. Jerome didn't even flinch. He reached the stage, jumped up in one fluid motion, and stood towering over the chairman. Jerome didn't strike him. He simply reached out and took the glass of champagne from Sterling's hand. He poured it slowly onto the stage. "You thought you could take a man's home because he looked like an easy target," Jerome whispered, loud enough for the front row to hear. "You forgot that the most dangerous man in the world is the one protecting his family." At that moment, the real police, Commander Miller's hand-picked units, burst through the side entrances. They didn't go for Jerome, they went for the stage. "Arthur Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and racketeering," Miller announced, his voice filled with a grim satisfaction. As the zip ties were tightened around Sterling's wrists, the Council of 12 crumbled. Members were being pulled from their tables, their golden masks falling to reveal the terrified faces of criminals. The aftermath. 6 months later. The Georgia sun was setting again, painting the sky in streaks of gold and deep purple. The High Tower home was fully rebuilt, stronger, safer, and filled with the smell of hickory smoke. Jerome sat on the porch, watching Marcus man the grill. The ghosts had stayed. They had turned Jerome's old repair shop into a cutting-edge security firm, a place where veterans could find work and the community could find protection that the badge had failed to provide. Vanessa sat beside him, the bruise on her cheek long gone, replaced by a smile that finally reached her eyes. Tobias was shooting hoops in the driveway, and Illa was reading a book under the oak tree. Jerome looked at his hands, the hands of a soldier, a mechanic, and a father. He had been targeted because they thought he was small. They didn't realize that a man's size isn't measured by his weight or his bank account. It's measured by the depth of his roots and the strength of his resolve. The smoke from the barbecue drifted up toward the stars. It wasn't the smoke of a war zone anymore. It was the smoke of a victory. They came to break a man, but all they did was remind him who he really is. Jerome High Tower's story is a reminder that justice isn't given, it's taken. If this story moved you, if you believe that a man's home is his castle and no one has the right to tear it down, then show your support. Click that like button to stand with Jerome. Subscribe to this channel right now because there are more heroes in the shadows and their stories need to be told. Don't let the council win, share this video, and let the world know that when you target one of us, you target all of us. Thank you for watching until the very end. I have handpicked 2 more stories of justice and survival on the screen right now. Choose one, and I'll see you there. Stay vigilant, stay strong.